I was lying unconscious on an operating table when my mother-in-law sold my house out from under me for a fraction of its worth to her poker buddy's son. She thought I was just another helpless woman who had gotten lucky marrying her precious boy. What she didn't know was that I owned the luxurious retirement community where she'd been living rent-free for the past 2 years, and her lease was about to expire. When I woke up from surgery to find moving trucks outside my window and strangers walking through my home with keys, I realized it was time she learned exactly who she'd been messing with. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights in the pre-op room buzzed overhead like angry wasps, casting everything in that particular shade of institutional white that makes healthy people feel sick. I adjusted the thin hospital gown that barely covered my knees, acutely aware of how vulnerable I looked lying on the narrow gurney. The IV needle in my left hand felt cold against my skin, a metallic reminder that in 30 minutes, I would be completely at the mercy of strangers with scalpels. My name is Christine Walsh, and at 34, I had never been more terrified in my life, not of the surgery itself. Drive. Martinez had assured me that the gallbladder removal was routine, practically assembly line medicine these days. What terrified me was leaving my life unguarded for 6 hours, while Barbara Walsh, my mother-in-law, had full access to everything I'd worked so hard to build. The morning had started normally enough. I'd been doubled over in pain at 4 a.m., clutching my side as waves of agony rolled through my abdomen. David, my husband of 3 years, had driven me to Riverside General Hospital with the kind of panicked efficiency that comes from watching someone you love suffer. By 6 a.m., the emergency room doctor had confirmed what I'd suspected, gallstones, and they needed to come out immediately. I should call my mother, David had said, pacing the small examination room while I signed consent forms with a shaking hand. She'll want to know what's happening. I had hesitated, pen hovering over the signature line. Barbara Walsh and I had what could generously be called a complicated relationship. She'd made it clear from the moment David introduced us that she considered me an opportunistic interloper who had somehow tricked her successful son into marriage. The fact that I owned and operated 3 successful businesses seemed to escape her notice entirely, or perhaps she chose to ignore it because it didn't fit her narrative of me as a gold digger. Maybe wait until after the surgery, I had suggested, but David was already dialing. Barbara arrived at the hospital 45 minutes later, sweeping into the pre-op area like she owned the place. At 68, she was still an imposing woman, silver hair perfectly styled despite the early hour, wearing a navy blazer that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. She had the kind of bearing that came from decades of getting her way through sheer force of personality. "Christine, darling," she said, though her tone suggested anything but affection. "How are we feeling?" The royal "we" grated on my nerves, but I was too focused on the upcoming surgery to engage in our usual verbal sparring. "I've been better," I managed, trying to smile for David's sake. Barbara turned to her son, effectively dismissing me from the conversation. "David, you look exhausted. Why don't you go home and get some rest while Christine is in surgery? I'll stay here and handle everything." Something cold settled in my stomach that had nothing to do with preoperative anxiety. Barbara had been pushing for more involvement in our lives ever since David and I had bought our house on Elmwood Avenue 2 years ago. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. It was a beautiful colonial revival with original hardwood floors and a wraparound porch. The kind of place I'd dreamed of owning since I was a little girl growing up in my grandmother's cramped apartment above her bakery. More importantly, it was mine. I had purchased it outright with profits from my property management company, a business I'd built from scratch after college, while working 3 part-time jobs to pay the bills. David's name wasn't on the deed because we hadn't been married when I bought it, and honestly, I'd wanted something that was completely mine after years of financial uncertainty. "Actually," I said, reaching for David's hand, "I'd prefer if you stayed. The surgery should only take a few hours." Barbara's lips tightened almost imperceptibly. "David needs his rest. I'm perfectly capable of handling hospital bureaucracy, dear. I did raise 3 children, after all." The anesthesiologist appeared before I could argue further, a kind-faced woman in her 50s, who explained the procedure with the patience of someone who'd had this conversation thousands of times. As they prepared to wheel me into the operating room, I squeezed David's hand one more time. "I love you," I whispered, though my eyes were on Barbara, who was watching our interaction with the calculating expression I'd learned to recognize in fear. "Love you too," David said, kissing my forehead. "I'll be right here when you wake up." But he wouldn't be, and neither would my house. The anesthesia hit like a warm wave, pulling me under before I could voice the growing sense of unease that had been building in my chest. My last conscious thought was wondering why Barbara had that particular smile on her face, the one she usually reserved for moments when she'd gotten exactly what she wanted. I woke up 6 hours later to the sound of voices in the hallway, and a throat so dry it felt like sandpaper. The recovery room was dim, monitors beeping steadily beside my bed, and for a moment I couldn't remember where I was or why my abdomen felt like someone had used it for target practice. Then memory came flooding back. The surgery, the hospital, David's worried face as they wheeled me away. A nurse appeared at my bedside, checking my vitals with practiced efficiency. "How are you feeling, Mrs. Walsh? Pain level 1 to 10? "Maybe a 6, I croaked, though honestly, the physical pain was nothing compared to the growing anxiety about why David wasn't there. "Where's my husband?" "He stepped out about an hour ago," she said, adjusting my IV. "Your mother-in-law said he needed to take care of some urgent business at home." Urgent business. My blood pressure monitor started beeping faster. "What kind of urgent business?" The nurse shrugged. She didn't say, but she mentioned something about paperwork that couldn't wait. She seemed very concerned about getting everything handled properly. I tried to sit up, gasping as pain shot through my incision. "I need to call him." "Can you get my phone?" "Let's focus on your recovery first," the nurse said gently. "You've been through a lot today. Your family will be back soon." But they weren't back soon. As the afternoon stretched into evening, I called David's cell phone repeatedly, getting voicemail each time. I called our house phone and got our answering machine. By 8 p.m., when visiting hours were ending and I was being moved to a regular room for overnight observation, panic had settled into my bones like arthritis. "Mrs. Walsh," Dr. Martinez said, appearing for post-operative rounds. "Your surgery went perfectly. We'll have you home tomorrow morning." Home. The word should have brought comfort, but all I could think about was Barbara's smile and David's absence, and that urgent business that couldn't wait. I managed to sleep fitfully, jerked awake every few hours by dreams of empty houses and missing keys. The next morning brought David, finally, but he looked haggard and wouldn't meet my eyes directly. He helped me get dressed and signed my discharge papers with the kind of mechanical efficiency that suggested his mind was elsewhere entirely. "How was everything at home?" I asked as we waited for the wheelchair that would take me to the parking garage. "Fine," he said quickly. "Just some paperwork Mom thought we should handle while you were recovering." "What kind of paperwork?" David's hands fidgeted with his car keys. "Insurance stuff. You know how she worries about having everything in order." I knew no such thing. Barbara Walsh had never shown the slightest interest in our insurance policies or financial arrangements. If anything, she'd been pointedly uninterested in the practical aspects of our life together, preferring to focus on criticizing my cooking or suggesting that David deserved someone who came from a, quote, better family background. The ride home was quiet, David concentrating on driving with unusual intensity while I stared out the window at the familiar neighborhoods leading to Elmwood Avenue. Everything looked normal. The same tree-lined streets, the same carefully maintained lawns, the same sense of suburban prosperity that had drawn me to this area in the first place. Until we turned onto our street, there was a moving truck parked in our driveway. "David," I said slowly, watching two men carry our dining room table toward the truck's open mouth. "Why is there a moving truck at our house?" David's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. "Christine, I can explain." "Explain what?" My voice was getting higher, panic making it hard to breathe properly. "Why are strangers loading our furniture into a truck?" He pulled into the driveway behind the moving truck, but made no move to get out of the car. Mom found a buyer for the house. She said you'd discuss selling and that with the surgery and everything, you wanted to get it handled quickly. The words hit me like physical blows. I never discussed selling our house with your mother. This is our home, David. My home. She had all the paperwork, David said miserably. She said you'd signed power of attorney forms before the surgery in case something went wrong. I stared at him, understanding dawning like a particularly brutal sunrise. I never signed any power of attorney forms. Your mother forged my signature and sold my house while I was unconscious. David finally looked at me, and I could see in his eyes that he was beginning to understand the magnitude of what had happened. That's not possible. Mom wouldn't do something like that. But even as he said it, doubt was creeping into his voice. Because somewhere deep down, he knew exactly what his mother was capable of when she decided someone was a threat to her carefully ordered world. I got out of the car on unsteady legs, my surgical incision pulling with each step. The moving men paused their work to stare at the woman in sweatpants and a hospital bracelet who was marching toward her own front door with murder in her eyes. "Excuse me," I called to the older of the two movers. "Who hired you to move this furniture?" "Lady named Barbara Walsh," he said, consulting his clipboard. "Said the house sold and everything needed to be out by today." "And where exactly are you taking my belongings?" He looked confused by my tone. "Storage unit across town." Mrs. Walsh said the new owners wanted immediate occupancy. I walked up the front steps to my own house, noting that the locks had been changed. The key I'd carried for 2 years no longer fit the door I'd painted myself last spring. Through the window, I could see strangers walking through my living room, pointing at the crown molding I'd saved for months to afford. That's when I saw Barbara. She was standing in what used to be my kitchen, gesticulating grandly to a young couple who were nodding eagerly at whatever she was telling them. She wore a different outfit than yesterday, a cream-colored suit that made her look like a successful real estate agent rather than a woman who had just committed what amounted to theft on a massive scale. I knocked on the window, loudly. Barbara looked up, and for just a moment I saw something flicker across her face. Not guilt, exactly, but surprise that I was there at all. She'd probably assumed I'd be laid up for days, giving her time to spin whatever story she'd concocted to explain why David's wife had suddenly decided to sell their home. She walked to the front door and opened it with my own keys, the ones she must have taken from David's keychain while I was unconscious. "Christine, darling," she said, as if nothing unusual was happening. "You should be resting." "Barbara," I said, my voice deadly quiet, "what have you done?" "I've helped you make a very smart financial decision," she replied smoothly. "The Hendersons made an excellent offer on the house, and with your medical expenses, I thought it would be wise to accept." The Hendersons. The young couple in my kitchen were the Hendersons, and they thought they were about to buy my house from someone who had the legal right to sell it. "I never authorized you to sell anything," I said, loud enough for the Hendersons to hear. "This woman has no legal right to sell this property." Mrs. Henderson looked confused. "I'm sorry, I thought you were the owner." Mrs. Walsh showed us all the paperwork. "Mrs. Walsh is my mother-in-law," I explained, trying to keep my voice level despite the rage building in my chest. "She forged my signature and sold my house without my knowledge or consent while I was in surgery." The Hendersons exchanged glances. This was clearly not the smooth real estate transaction they'd been expecting. Barbara's composure cracked slightly. "Christine, you're obviously still groggy from the anesthesia. Perhaps we should discuss this privately." "Oh, we'll discuss it," I said. "But first, I'm calling the police." I pulled out my phone, noting that my hands were shaking with adrenaline rather than post-surgical weakness. As I dialed, I caught sight of David standing helplessly beside the moving truck, looking like a man who just realized he'd been played by an expert. 911. What's your emergency?" "I'd like to report a case of fraud and forgery," I said, never taking my eyes off Barbara's face. "Someone sold my house while I was in surgery and forged my signature on legal documents." Barbara's confident facade finally crumbled. "Christine, you don't understand the position you've put David in. This house is far too expensive for a young couple just starting out." I was only trying to help. "Help?" I laughed, and it wasn't a pleasant sound. You sold my house for what, Barbara? What did the Hendersons pay? Mrs. Henderson spoke up hesitantly. $250,000. Mrs. Walsh said you needed a quick sale. $250,000. For a house worth nearly $400,000 on the current market. Barbara hadn't just stolen my home, she'd stolen it at a massive loss, probably to ensure a quick transaction that would be hard to reverse. The police arrived 20 minutes later, by which time the Hendersons had fled and the moving truck had been stopped from leaving with my belongings. Officer Rodriguez listened to my explanation with the patient expression of someone who'd seen family disputes turn ugly before, taking notes as I showed him the deed with my name alone on it and explained about the forged power of attorney documents. Barbara maintained her innocence with the skill of someone who'd been manipulating situations for decades. There's clearly been a misunderstanding, she told the officer. Christine asked me to handle the sale while she recovered. I have all the signed paperwork. May I see this paperwork? Officer Rodriguez asked. Barbara hesitated for just a moment too long. It's at my attorney's office. I can have it here within the hour. But we all knew she couldn't, because it didn't exist. At least not in any legal form that would hold up to scrutiny. As the police sorted through the immediate situation, securing my house and stopping the fraudulent sale, I found myself standing on my front porch looking at the woman who had just tried to steal my life out from under me. Barbara Walsh, who had always seen me as beneath her son, who had never believed I deserved the success I'd worked so hard to achieve. She had no idea what she'd just started. Because, while Barbara thought she knew everything about my finances and my vulnerabilities, there was one thing she'd never bothered to investigate. One business venture I'd kept private, not out of secrecy but because it simply hadn't come up in family conversations. 2 years ago, using profits from my property management company, I had purchased a controlling interest in Sunset Manor, the luxury retirement community where Barbara had been living since David convinced me to help her with her housing situation. The same retirement community where she enjoyed a spacious 2-bedroom apartment, 3 meals a day, and access to amenities she could never afford on her fixed income. The same retirement community where her lease was set to expire in exactly 30 days. Barbara Walsh thought she'd played the perfect game, striking while I was vulnerable and eliminating what she saw as an obstacle to her control over her son's life. What she didn't know was that she'd just declared war on someone who held all the cards she didn't even know were in play. As Officer Rodriguez handed me the keys to my own house and assured me that charges would be filed for fraud and attempted theft, I looked at Barbara's furious face and smiled for the first time since waking up from surgery. Barbara, I said quietly, so only she could hear. I think we need to have a conversation about your living situation. The confusion in her eyes was almost worth everything she'd put me through. Almost. Tomorrow, she would discover just how big a mistake she'd made when she decided to mess with Christine Walsh. The seed of everything that would eventually lead to Barbara's downfall had been planted 7 years earlier. In the cramped office above my grandmother's bakery where I'd spent countless childhood afternoons doing homework while the smell of fresh bread drifted up through the floorboards, Grandma Rose had taught me 2 things that shaped everything I would become: how to spot people who underestimated you, and how to turn that blindness into your greatest advantage. I was 27 when I started Walsh Property Management, working out of a converted bedroom in my tiny apartment with nothing but a laptop, a prayer, and an absolute determination to never be financially vulnerable again. Growing up watching my single mother struggle to make rent every month had left me with a bone-deep fear of depending on anyone else for security. When other girls my age were planning weddings and dreaming of white picket fences, I was studying real estate law and learning how to read financial statements by flashlight when the electricity got cut off. The business started small, almost accidentally. I was working as an administrative assistant at a law firm downtown, making barely enough to cover my student loans and rent, when Mrs. Patterson from my apartment building asked if I could help her manage a duplex she'd inherited from her aunt. She was 73 and overwhelmed by tenant calls about leaky faucets and late rent payments. I offered to handle everything for a small percentage of the rental income, figuring it would give me some extra grocery money. Within 6 months, Mrs. Patterson was referring me to her friends at the senior center. Apparently, I had developed a reputation for being trustworthy, thorough, and willing to deal with the headaches that came with rental properties. More importantly, I had discovered something about myself. I was exceptionally good at seeing potential where others saw problems. The first property I convinced an owner to let me renovate was a disaster of a triplex in a neighborhood most people wrote off as too rough for investment. The previous management company had thrown up their hands after the third break-in, but I saw something different. I saw location, location, location. 3 blocks from the university, 5 minutes from the downtown business district, and priced so low that even after renovations, the numbers would work beautifully. I spent my weekends learning to install new fixtures, painting walls, and researching tenant screening processes. I negotiated with contractors, learning which ones would work with my limited budget and which ones were trying to take advantage of what they assumed was an inexperienced young woman. I made mistakes, plenty of them, but I learned from every single one. The triplex was fully occupied within 2 months of completion, with a waiting list of potential tenants. Mrs. Chen, the owner, was so impressed that she asked me to take over her other properties. Word spread through her network of immigrant business owners who appreciated someone who treated their investments with the same care they would give their own. By year 2, I was managing 37 units across the city. By year 3, I had hired my first employee, Maria, a recent college graduate who shared my philosophy that good property management was about building relationships, not just collecting rent checks. We operated out of a small office space I rented month to month, with secondhand furniture and a coffee maker that required percussive maintenance to function properly. The real breakthrough came during my 4th year in business, when the economic downturn hit the city like a freight train. Larger property management companies were dropping clients left and right, unable to maintain profitability when vacancy rates spiked, and rent collection became more challenging. Many property owners found themselves suddenly without management, facing the prospect of handling crisis situations themselves. That's when I realized that while my competitors were cutting services and raising fees to maintain their margins, I could do the opposite. I started offering more comprehensive services at competitive rates, positioning Walsh Property Management as the company that didn't abandon ship when things got difficult. I personally visited every property owner in my portfolio, explaining exactly how we would navigate the tough economic climate together. The strategy worked better than I had dared hope. Not only did I retain all my existing clients, but I picked up dozens of new ones from competitors who had dropped them. Property owners talked to each other, and the word spread that Christine Walsh was the one who stuck around when everyone else disappeared. It was during this period that I learned about Sunset Manor. The luxury retirement community had been struggling financially, caught between rising operational costs and residents on fixed incomes, who couldn't afford significant fee increases. The original developers had overextended themselves during construction, and the facility was facing foreclosure within the year. I had been managing a small apartment complex for Mr. and Mrs. Kovac, an elderly couple who mentioned during one of our monthly meetings that they were considering moving to Sunset Manor if it didn't close down. They spoke wistfully about the community's amenities, the social activities, the sense of security it provided for aging residents who wanted to maintain their independence. That night, I drove by Sunset Manor for the first time, studying the well-maintained grounds and elegant buildings. Even in financial distress, it was clearly a quality operation. The location was perfect, situated in an established neighborhood with mature trees and walking distance to medical facilities. The waiting list for admission, despite the financial uncertainty, suggested strong demand for this type of housing. I spent the next 3 months researching everything I could about senior living facilities, from operational requirements to financial projections to regulatory compliance. I attended city council meetings where Sunset Manor's future was discussed, taking notes while developers and politicians debated whether the facility could be saved or should be demolished for commercial development. What I learned was that the business model was fundamentally sound, but the financial structure was unsustainable. The original developers had taken on too much debt and made overly optimistic assumptions about occupancy rates and fee increases. However, with more conservative projections and better operational efficiency, the facility could be profitable. The challenge was coming up with the capital to acquire it. My property management business was successful, but I didn't have millions of dollars sitting in the bank. I needed to be creative, which meant structuring a deal that would work for both the distressed sellers and my limited liquidity. I started by approaching Mr. Davidson, the court-appointed receiver who was managing Sunset Manor's assets during the foreclosure process. I explained that I represented a group of investors interested in keeping the facility operating as senior housing rather than converting it to another use. This wasn't entirely truthful, since my group of investors consisted of me and a financial advisor I'd consulted, but it got me access to the detailed financial records I needed to structure an offer. The numbers were worse than I had expected, but not impossibly so. The facility was carrying debt that was nearly twice what the property could reasonably support, but the underlying real estate was valuable, and the operational losses were manageable with proper oversight. More importantly, there were several grants and tax incentives available for senior housing that the previous owners had never pursued. I spent weeks crafting a proposal that would allow me to acquire Sunset Manor through a combination of seller financing, assumption of restructured debt, and a relatively modest down payment I could manage by leveraging my property management portfolio. The key was convincing the receiver that my plan would generate more recovery for creditors than a liquidation sale. The presentation I gave to the bankruptcy court 3 months later was the most important 30 minutes of my professional life. I wore my best suit, the navy blue one I'd bought for job interviews, and spoke directly to the judge about my vision for turning Sunset Manor into a model senior living community that would serve residents with dignity while maintaining financial stability. Judge Harrison asked pointed questions about my experience with senior housing, my financial capacity, and my operational plans. I answered each one honestly, acknowledging my lack of direct experience while emphasizing my track record of successfully managing residential properties, and my commitment to learning whatever I needed to know to succeed. The moment that sealed the deal came when Mrs. Rodriguez, one of Sunset Manor's residents, stood up in the courtroom gallery and asked to speak. She was 82 years old, had lived at the facility for 3 years, and spoke with the kind of quiet authority that comes from a lifetime of experience. "Your Honor," she said, "I've watched this young woman attend every community meeting for the past 6 months. She asks good questions, she listens to our concerns, and she treats us like human beings, not like problems to be managed. Most importantly, she's here because she wants to be, not because someone is paying her to pretend to care." Judge Harrison approved my acquisition proposal that afternoon. Taking over Sunset Manor was like drinking from a fire hose. I had to learn healthcare regulations, Medicare reimbursement procedures, staffing requirements for assisted living facilities, food service management, and a dozen other specialized areas virtually overnight. I hired consultants where necessary, but I also spent long hours walking the halls, talking to residents and staff, understanding how the facility actually functioned day to day. The first year was brutal. There were plumbing emergencies at 3 a.m., staff shortages that required me to cover shifts personally, and regulatory inspections that felt like final exams for subjects I was still learning. I made mistakes, some of them expensive, but I also developed relationships with residents who became my biggest advocates and staff members, who appreciated working for someone who understood that their jobs were about caring for people, not just maintaining buildings. Slowly, steadily, Sunset Manor's financial picture improved. I renegotiated vendor contracts, implemented energy efficiency improvements, and successfully applied for several grants that previous management had overlooked. More importantly, I focused on creating the kind of community environment that made residents want to stay and encouraged them to refer their friends. By the end of the second year, we had a waiting list again. By the third year, we were consistently profitable. What had started as a distressed acquisition had become a showcase facility that other operators studied as a model for successful senior living management. Throughout this entire period, my relationship with David Walsh was developing in parallel. We had met at a coffee shop downtown where I was having a business meeting with a potential client, and he was grading papers at the next table. He was a high school history teacher, patient and thoughtful, with the kind of genuine kindness that drew me in despite my usual wariness about dating. David appreciated my ambition without being threatened by it, supported my business ventures without trying to manage them, and seemed genuinely impressed by what I had accomplished rather than intimidated by it. When he mentioned that his mother was looking for a place to live after selling the family home, I suggested Sunset Manor without thinking twice about it. Barbara Walsh toured the facility on a Thursday afternoon in October, accompanied by David, and wearing an expression that suggested she was being forced to consider accommodations far beneath her standards. I gave them the tour personally, pointing out the amenities, the activity programs, and the quality of care that made Sunset Manor special. "It's very nice, dear," Barbara said to me with the kind of condescension I had learned to recognize from people who assumed my age meant inexperience, though perhaps a bit ambitious for someone so young to be managing. I smiled politely and continued the tour, explaining our philosophy of treating residents as family members rather than clients. Barbara nodded along, asking questions that seemed designed more to demonstrate her sophistication than to gather useful information. What she didn't ask, and what I didn't volunteer, was who owned the facility. David knew, of course, but somehow it never came up in family conversations. Perhaps because Barbara seemed so uninterested in the details of my business ventures, or perhaps because David understood instinctively that his mother's opinion of me was complicated enough without adding the element of me being her potential landlord. Barbara moved into Sunset Manor 6 months before David and I got married. She selected a corner unit with southern exposure, complained about the move-in process despite receiving white glove service, and settled into the community with the air of someone conferring a great honor by her presence. From my perspective as the owner, she was an ideal resident. She paid her fees promptly, participated in activities, and maintained her apartment impeccably. She made friends with other residents, and even volunteered to help with the facility's fundraising committee. Whatever personal friction existed between us seemed to stay outside the walls of Sunset Manor. I told myself that this arrangement was working perfectly. Barbara had a beautiful, safe place to live that she could afford on her retirement income. David was relieved that his mother was settled and happy. And I had gained a resident who helped elevate the facility's social atmosphere. What I didn't anticipate was how much Barbara resented not knowing that her living situation depended entirely on my goodwill. She had no idea that the young woman she dismissed as an opportunistic gold digger was the same person who ensured her apartment was maintained, her meals were prepared, and her medical needs were monitored by trained professionals. She saw me as someone who had gotten lucky by marrying her son. She had no understanding of the years of 18-hour days, the calculated risks, the careful relationship building that had made my success possible. More importantly, she had no appreciation for the fact that I had consistently chosen to be generous when I could have been mercenary. When Barbara made her move to sell my house while I was unconscious on an operating table, she thought she was dealing with a helpless victim who would have no recourse against her superior experience and connections. She had never bothered to investigate the full extent of my business holdings or consider that someone she viewed as beneath her might actually hold significant power over her own circumstances. That oversight was about to become the most expensive mistake of her life. As I stood in my reclaimed house, watching the police finish their investigation and thinking about the conversation I would need to have with Barbara tomorrow, I reflected on how completely she had misunderstood the situation. She had seen my youth and assumed naivete. She had seen my quiet demeanor and assumed weakness. She had seen my respect for David's family relationships and assumed she could manipulate them to her advantage. All of those assumptions were about to be tested in ways Barbara Walsh could never have imagined. The foundation I had spent 7 years building, from that first duplex management contract to the acquisition of Sunset Manor, had been constructed with one principle in mind: always have more options than the other person thinks you have. Barbara was about to learn exactly what that meant. The morning after the police had restored my house keys and launched their investigation into Barbara's fraudulent sale, I woke up before dawn with surgical pain radiating through my abdomen and a clarity of purpose I hadn't felt in years. David lay beside me, finally asleep after a night of restless tossing and muttered apologies that felt hollow in the darkness. He kept saying he didn't know, that his mother had convinced him I'd agreed to the sale, that he should have questioned her more carefully. But we both knew the truth was more complicated than that. David had wanted to believe his mother because believing her was easier than confronting the possibility that the woman who raised him was capable of such calculated cruelty. He had chosen willful blindness over difficult conversations, and that choice had nearly cost us everything. I dressed carefully that morning, selecting a charcoal gray business suit that made me look older and more authoritative than my 34 years. The tailored jacket concealed the surgical dressing on my abdomen while projecting the kind of professional competence that Barbara had consistently refused to acknowledge. I applied makeup with deliberate precision, covering the pallor of recent illness and creating the appearance of someone fully in control of her circumstances. My first stop was the district attorney's office, where Detective Morrison had promised to meet me at 8 a.m. to discuss the charges being filed against Barbara. The DA's office occupied the top 3 floors of a downtown building that had seen better decades, with fluorescent lighting that made everyone look either dead or guilty. Detective Morrison was a woman in her 40s with graying hair and the kind of patient demeanor that suggested she'd seen every variety of family betrayal imaginable. "Mrs. Walsh," she said, gesturing for me to sit in the plastic chair across from her metal desk. "I've reviewed the initial police report and the documentation you provided. This is definitely fraud, and given the amount involved, we're looking at felony charges." The words should have brought satisfaction, but instead I felt only a cold determination to see this through to its conclusion. "What happens next?" "We'll need a formal statement from you detailing exactly what happened and what authorization, if any, you gave your mother-in-law regarding the sale of your property. We'll also need copies of all relevant documents proving your ownership and any communications you had with her about the house." I opened my briefcase and removed a folder I'd prepared the night before. "Here are copies of the deed, my mortgage documents, homeowners insurance policies, and property tax records. Everything shows my name only as the owner. I've also printed out text message exchanges between Barbara and myself over the past 6 months. You'll notice there's no mention anywhere of selling the house." Detective Morrison flipped through the documents with professional thoroughness. "This is very complete. Most people don't keep such organized records. I learned early that documentation protects you when people try to take advantage," I said. "My business depends on maintaining clear records of every transaction and agreement." She nodded approvingly. "What about your husband? Will he be willing to testify about what his mother told him?" This was the question I'd been dreading. David's testimony would be crucial to establishing that Barbara had knowingly deceived both of us, but asking him to testify against his own mother in a criminal proceeding felt like forcing him to choose sides in a war he'd never wanted to fight. "I believe so," I said carefully. "He's as shocked as I am by what she did. But I'd like to handle this as diplomatically as possible. Barbara is still his mother." Detective Morrison's expression suggested she'd heard similar sentiments before, usually from victims who later changed their minds about prosecution when family pressure mounted. "Mrs. Walsh, I need you to understand that once we file formal charges, this becomes a criminal matter. Your mother-in-law could face significant jail time if convicted. Family dynamics tend to get complicated when that reality sets in." "I understand," I said. "But what she did was more than a family disagreement. She committed serious crimes, and there have to be consequences." After leaving the DA's office, I drove to Walsh Property Management's headquarters, a converted warehouse space we'd moved into the previous year when our client base had grown beyond what our original office could accommodate. The building sat in an industrial district that was slowly gentrifying, surrounded by art studios and craft breweries that attracted young professionals looking for authenticity on a budget. Maria greeted me with a concerned frown as I walked through the front door. "Christine, you should be home recovering. The surgery was just 2 days ago." "I'm fine," I lied, settling carefully into my desk chair and trying not to wince as my incision pulled. "I need to check on a few things and then I'll head home." But I didn't go home. Instead, I spent the morning reviewing the operational reports from Sunset Manor, studying occupancy rates, financial projections, and lease renewal schedules, with an attention to detail that would have seemed obsessive to anyone who didn't understand what I was planning. Barbara's lease was scheduled for renewal in exactly 28 days. Like all residents, she had signed a year-long agreement with specific terms regarding rent increases, behavioral expectations, and grounds for non-renewal. The contract she'd signed was standard for the industry, but it contained several clauses that most residents never paid attention to because they assumed their tenancy would continue automatically as long as they paid their fees and followed basic community guidelines. What Barbara didn't know, because she'd never bothered to read the fine print, was that lease renewals at Sunset Manor were not automatic. They required approval from the facility's ownership based on a variety of factors, including payment history, community compatibility, and what the contract vaguely termed operational considerations. As the primary owner, I had broad discretion in renewal decisions. The contract specifically stated that residents could be denied renewal for any reason not prohibited by fair housing laws, with 30 days written notice. It was a standard protective clause that I'd never had reason to invoke, but it existed for situations exactly like this one. I pulled Barbara's resident file and spread the contents across my desk. Payment history, impeccable. Community involvement, exemplary. Maintenance requests, reasonable and appropriately submitted. References from staff, uniformly positive. On paper, Barbara Walsh was a model resident who should absolutely have her lease renewed without question. But the contract also contained a clause about residents whose continued tenancy might create conflicts of interest or operational complications for the facility's management. It was another standard provision, originally intended to address situations like family members of staff or business partners of ownership, who might create awkward dynamics within the community. I had never imagined I would need to invoke this clause against my own mother-in-law, but then again, I had never imagined my own mother-in-law would try to steal my house while I was unconscious. My phone rang, interrupting my review of Barbara's file. The caller ID showed Sunset Manor's main number. Christine? It was Helen Murray, the facility's administrator and my most trusted employee at the manor. I hate to bother you while you're recovering, but we have a situation here that needs your attention. My stomach clenched. What kind of situation? It's Mrs. Walsh, actually. Barbara Walsh. She's been telling other residents that there are going to be major changes in the facility's management, and that she has inside information about new ownership coming in. She's got several people quite worked up about potential rent increases and policy changes. I closed my eyes, feeling the pieces of Barbara's strategy clicking into place. She wasn't just spreading rumors. She was positioning herself as having special knowledge and influence over Sunset Manor's future, probably building credibility for whatever story she planned to tell about why her daughter-in-law had suddenly become hostile toward her. What exactly is she saying? That her son's wife has been making financial mistakes that are going to affect the facility's stability. She's suggesting that residents should start looking at alternative housing options before they're forced to leave on short notice. Mrs. Patterson asked me directly if it was true that you were selling the facility. The audacity was breathtaking. Barbara was attempting to undermine my reputation with my own residents, probably hoping to create enough instability to force me into a defensive position, where I'd be less likely to pursue legal action against her. Helen, please schedule a community meeting for tomorrow afternoon. I'll address these concerns directly with all residents. Are you sure you're up for that? You just had surgery. I'm sure, I said, though my incision throbbed in protest at the thought of standing for an hour answering questions from worried seniors. And Helen, please make sure Mrs. Walsh knows about the meeting. I want her there. After hanging up, I leaned back in my chair and considered the chess game Barbara had initiated. She clearly believed she understood the board better than I did, that her years of experience manipulating family dynamics gave her advantages I couldn't match. She was banking on my reluctance to create a public confrontation that would embarrass David and divide his family permanently. What she didn't understand was that I had learned to play chess from my grandmother, who had built a successful business during the Depression, by understanding that sometimes you had to sacrifice pieces to protect your king. Barbara thought she was attacking my business reputation, but what she was actually doing was giving me the perfect justification for what I was about to do anyway. I spent the rest of the afternoon preparing for the community meeting, reviewing financial statements and operational reports that would demonstrate Sunset Manor's stability and my competence as an owner. I also drafted a document that I hoped I wouldn't need to use but wanted to have ready just in case Barbara forced my hand. The community meeting was scheduled for 2 p.m. in Sunset Manor's main dining room, a spacious area with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the facility's gardens. By the time I arrived, slightly out of breath from the exertion of walking from the parking lot while still recovering from surgery, nearly 60 residents had gathered in the folding chairs Helen had arranged in neat rows. Barbara sat in the front row, wearing a burgundy dress that managed to look both elegant and somehow martyred. She had positioned herself directly in my line of sight, no doubt intending to project confidence and authority to the other residents. Several people had clustered around her before the meeting started, clearly seeking her perspective on whatever changes might be coming. I had dressed professionally but warmly, choosing a navy blue cardigan over a simple white blouse that made me look approachable rather than intimidating. The goal was to reassure people, not demonstrate power, though I kept the folder containing Barbara's lease non-renewal notice within easy reach. "Good afternoon, everyone," I began, standing at the front of the room despite the pulling sensation in my abdomen. "I called this meeting because I understand there have been some concerns about Sunset Manor's management and financial stability. I want to address those concerns directly and give you accurate information about our situation." I opened with a brief overview of the facility's financial health, citing specific numbers that demonstrated steady profitability and strong reserves. I explained our occupancy rates, which consistently exceeded industry averages, and our resident satisfaction scores, which ranked among the highest in the region. "Some of you may have heard rumors about potential ownership changes or management instability," I continued, allowing my eyes to sweep across the room without lingering on Barbara. "I want to assure you that these rumors are completely unfounded. Sunset Manor's ownership structure has not changed, and we have no plans to sell the facility or make any major operational changes." Mrs. Patterson, one of the residents I'd grown particularly fond of over the years, raised her hand. "Christine, dear, we've also heard that you might be having financial difficulties that could affect the facility. Is there any truth to that?" I smiled at her gently. "Mrs. Patterson, I appreciate your concern. It's true that I recently had surgery and will be recovering for a few more days. But my personal health has no impact on Sunset Manor's operations or financial stability. We have excellent management staff who handle day-to-day operations, and the facility's finances are completely separate from my personal circumstances." Another hand went up, this one from Mr. Chen, a retired accountant who asked detailed questions at every resident meeting. "What about the rumor that you're planning to sell the property to developers who want to tear it down for condominiums?" This question drew murmurs of concern from around the room. I could see Barbara leaning forward slightly, waiting to see how I would respond to what was clearly one of the stories she'd been spreading. "Mr. Chen, that rumor is not only false, it's financially nonsensical," I said with a slight laugh. "Sunset Manor is profitable and operating at full capacity with a waiting list. Why would any rational business owner sell a successful enterprise to developers? Moreover, the property is zoned specifically for senior housing, and changing that zoning would require a lengthy political process that would make such a development highly unlikely." The tension in the room began to ease as residents realized they were hearing facts and numbers rather than vague warnings about unnamed threats. I continued with specific examples of recent improvements to the facility, upcoming events and programs, and our plans for expanding services in the coming year. "Are there any other questions?" I asked as my presentation wound down. Barbara's hand shot up. She had been waiting for this moment, and I could see the calculated look in her eyes that I'd learned to recognize and dread. "Christine, dear," she said in a tone that managed to sound both concerned and condescending, "I think it's wonderful that you're trying to reassure everyone, but don't you think the residents deserve to know about your recent legal troubles? And how those might affect your ability to manage this facility properly?" The room went dead silent. Every eye turned to me, waiting to see how I would respond to what was clearly a carefully planned attack designed to undermine my credibility and force me into a defensive position. I had two choices. I could take the high road, deflect the question politely, and deal with Barbara privately later. Or I could end this game once and for all, right here in front of 60 witnesses, who would make sure the story spread through every corner of the facility within hours. I looked at Barbara's expectant face, seeing the confidence there, the certainty that she had just delivered a killing blow that would leave me scrambling to maintain my reputation and authority. She truly believed she had outmaneuvered me, that her years of experience in family manipulation had given her tools I couldn't match. She was about to learn how wrong she was. "Barbara," I said quietly, my voice carrying clearly through the silent room, "I'm glad you brought up legal matters because that gives me the opportunity to address something important with everyone here." I reached for the folder I'd placed on the table beside me, the one containing Barbara's lease non-renewal notice. As most of you know, Mrs. Walsh is my mother-in-law. What you don't know is that 2 days ago, while I was unconscious during surgery, She forged my signature and sold my house to her friends for significantly below market value. Gasps echoed around the room. Several residents turned to stare at Barbara, whose confident expression was rapidly transforming into something approaching panic. The police are currently investigating this matter, and criminal charges have been filed for fraud and forgery. Mrs. Walsh is facing potential felony convictions that could result in significant jail time. Barbara's face had gone pale, but she tried to maintain her composure. Christine, you're obviously still confused from the anesthesia. There's been a misunderstanding. There's been no misunderstanding, I interrupted firmly. The police have reviewed all the documentation. Detective Morrison at the DA's office confirmed yesterday that they have a clear case of fraud. The sale was illegal and has been voided. The room was so quiet I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the corner. 60 pairs of eyes moved back and forth between Barbara and me, like spectators at a tennis match, trying to process what they were hearing. Now, I continued, opening the folder and removing the document I'd prepared. This creates an unfortunate situation for Sunset Manor, because Mrs. Walsh's continued residency here creates what our legal counsel has identified as a significant conflict of interest and potential liability for the facility. Barbara's eyes widened as she realized where this was heading. You can't. Actually, I can, I said calmly, holding up the lease non-renewal notice. According to the terms of the residential agreement that Mrs. Walsh signed when she moved in, lease renewals are subject to approval by facility ownership based on operational considerations. Having a resident who is currently under criminal investigation for defrauding the facility's owner clearly falls under the category of operational complications. I walked over to Barbara's chair and handed her the official notice, speaking loud enough for everyone in the room to hear clearly. Mrs. Walsh, this is your formal 30-day notice of lease non-renewal. Your tenancy at Sunset Manor will terminate on October 15th. You'll need to make alternative housing arrangements. The silence that followed was deafening. Barbara stared at the document in her hands as if she couldn't quite believe what she was reading. Around the room, residents whispered to each other, processing the dramatic reversal they'd just witnessed. This is ridiculous, Barbara said finally, her voice shaking with rage rather than fear. You can't evict me because of a family disagreement. I'll sue you for discrimination, for harassment, for… Mrs. Walsh, I interrupted quietly, you're not being evicted because of a family disagreement. You're being denied lease renewal because you committed serious crimes against the facility's owner. Sunset Manor's insurance company and legal counsel have both confirmed that continuing your residency would create unacceptable liability exposure. I turned back to address the room at large. I want to assure everyone else that this situation is unique and does not reflect any broader changes in facility policies or management. Mrs. Walsh's tenancy is being terminated solely because of her criminal actions, not because of any operational or financial issues with Sunset Manor. Mrs. Patterson raised her hand tentatively. Christine, dear, what if the charges are dropped or if she's found not guilty? It was a fair question, and I had anticipated it. The lease non-renewal is based on the conflict of interest created by the pending criminal charges, not on the ultimate outcome of those charges. Even if Mrs. Walsh were acquitted, which seems highly unlikely given the evidence, the trust necessary for a positive landlord-tenant relationship has been irreparably damaged. Barbara stood up abruptly, clutching the non-renewal notice. This is vindictive and petty, Christine. I'm your husband's mother. Yes, I agreed. And you used that relationship to gain my trust, enter my home, and commit crimes against me while I was helpless in a hospital bed. The fact that you're David's mother makes what you did worse, not better. She looked around the room, perhaps hoping to find supportive faces among the other residents. Instead, she found people staring at her with expressions ranging from shock to disgust. Whatever social capital she'd built up at Sunset Manor had evaporated the moment the scope of her betrayal became clear. You'll regret this, Barbara said, her voice low and venomous. David will never forgive you for treating his family this way. I met her eyes steadily. David's family includes me, Barbara. You seem to have forgotten that when you decided to steal my house. Without another word, Barbara turned and walked out of the dining room, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. The sound echoed in the silence until the door closed behind her, leaving 60 stunned residents and one very tired facility owner to process what had just happened. Mr. Chen was the first to speak. "Well," he said in his precise, accountant's voice, "that was certainly more excitement than I expected from a community meeting." Nervous laughter rippled through the room, breaking the tension. People began talking among themselves, processing the drama they'd witnessed, and probably already planning how they would tell the story to friends and family members. I answered a few more questions about facility operations and upcoming events, but it was clear that everyone's attention was still focused on the confrontation they'd just witnessed. After about 10 more minutes, I thanked everyone for coming and began gathering my materials. As residents filed out of the dining room, several stopped to speak with me privately. Mrs. Patterson squeezed my hand and whispered, "You did the right thing, dear. Family or not, what she did was terrible." Mr. Chen nodded approvingly and said, "Good business decision. Can't have residents thinking they can take advantage of management." But it was Mrs. Rodriguez, the elderly woman who had spoken up for me during the bankruptcy hearing years earlier, who best captured what I was feeling. "Mija," she said, using the Spanish endearment she'd adopted for me, "sometimes the people who should protect us are the ones we need protection from. You protected yourself, and you protected all of us by showing that actions have consequences." As I drove home that afternoon, my incision aching from the stress of standing for an hour, I reflected on the bridge I had just burned. There would be no going back from this confrontation, no possibility of repairing my relationship with Barbara or pretending that family harmony was more important than justice. David would be devastated when he learned what had happened. He would probably accuse me of going too far, of using my position as Sunset Manor's owner to exact personal revenge, rather than seeking justice through proper legal channels. He might even be right about my motivations, though I preferred to think of it as ensuring that Barbara understood the full consequences of her actions. But as I pulled into the driveway of my house, the house that was mine again because I had fought to keep it, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the deep satisfaction of winning a war that someone else had started. Barbara Walsh had made the mistake of thinking she could manipulate me, because she saw me as young, inexperienced, and dependent on her son's love. She had gambled that I would prioritize family peace over personal justice, that I would accept her theft rather than fight back in ways that would hurt David. She had been wrong about all of it. Now she had 30 days to find somewhere else to live, and I had the rest of my life to enjoy the knowledge that when someone had tried to destroy me, I hadn't just survived, I had won. The first sign that Barbara's world was beginning to collapse came exactly 72 hours after I handed her the lease non-renewal notice. I was in my home office, still moving carefully due to my healing incision, when my phone rang with a call from Helen at Sunset Manor. Her voice carried an unusual tension that immediately put me on alert. "Christine, I need to tell you about something that happened this morning." Mrs. Walsh came to the front desk asking to speak with our legal department about challenging her lease termination. I set down the financial reports I'd been reviewing and focused entirely on the conversation. "What did you tell her?" "That all legal matters needed to go through our attorney's office, and I gave her the contact information. But that's not the concerning part." She became very agitated when I explained the process, and she started making statements about how she was going to make sure everyone knows the truth about this place, and that she had connections that could shut us down. My stomach tightened. Barbara was escalating rather than retreating, which meant she still believed she had cards to play that I didn't know about. Did she make any specific threats? She mentioned something about contacting the state licensing board and the local media. She also said something about quote, financial irregularities that she was going to report. "Christine, I'm worried she's going to try to damage the facility's reputation out of spite." After hanging up with Helen, I spent the rest of the morning researching exactly what kind of damage Barbara could potentially cause. State licensing boards took complaints seriously, even unfounded ones, and investigations could take months to resolve while casting doubt on a facility's operations. Media attention could be even more damaging, especially if Barbara managed to frame her eviction as elder abuse or discrimination, rather than the consequence of her own criminal behavior. The irony wasn't lost on me that Barbara was now threatening to use the same tactics against Sunset Manor that she'd tried to use against me personally, spreading rumors and undermining confidence to force a defensive response. But unlike her attack on my house, this threat had the potential to harm innocent people, the other residents who depended on Sunset Manor for their housing and care, and the employees whose livelihoods depended on the facility's continued success. That afternoon, I drove to downtown to meet with Robert Chen, the attorney who handled Sunset Manor's legal affairs. His office occupied the corner suite of a restored Victorian building, with tall windows that overlooked the courthouse, where I'd first presented my plan to acquire the facility years earlier. Robert was in his 60s, with the kind of measured demeanor that came from decades of helping people navigate complex legal situations. "Christine," he said after I'd explained Barbara's threats, "the good news is that your decision to terminate her lease was legally sound. The conflict of interest clause in your residential agreement specifically covers this type of situation. The criminal charges against her provide clear justification for the non-renewal. And the bad news? The bad news is that being legally correct doesn't prevent her from filing complaints or speaking to reporters. State licensing boards are required to investigate all complaints, regardless of their merit. Even if the investigation ultimately exonerates you, the process can be disruptive and expensive." Robert leaned back in his leather chair, studying me with the careful attention of someone assessing a client's resolve. "There's also the family dynamic to consider. Your husband's relationship with his mother complicates things legally and personally. Have you discussed this situation with David?" I had been dreading this question since walking out of the community meeting 3 days earlier. David knew about the lease non-renewal, of course, but our conversations about it had been tense and painful. He understood intellectually that Barbara's actions had forced my hand, but emotionally he was struggling with watching his family tear itself apart. "David supports my decision to pursue criminal charges against his mother," I said carefully. "But he's hoping we can find a way to handle the housing situation more quietly." Robert nodded knowingly. "Family cases are always the most complicated because the legal issues and personal relationships are so intertwined. From a purely business perspective, removing Mrs. Walsh from the facility protects your other residents and your reputation. From a family perspective, it creates a permanent rift that affects everyone." "What would you do if someone stole your house while you were in surgery?" I asked bluntly. "I'd probably do exactly what you're doing," he admitted. "But I'd also make sure I was prepared for whatever comes next. Your mother-in-law strikes me as someone who doesn't accept defeat gracefully." Robert's assessment proved prophetic. The next morning I woke to find 3 missed calls from Helen, all placed before 7 a.m. When I called back, her voice was tight with stress. "Christine, we have a problem. Mrs. Walsh contacted Channel 7 News last night. They're sending a reporter here this afternoon to do a story about, quote, questionable eviction practices at local senior facilities." I closed my eyes, feeling the familiar sensation of a crisis spinning beyond my control. Did she tell them about the criminal charges? "According to the producer I spoke with, Mrs. Walsh is claiming that you're retaliating against her for, quote, questioning your business practices, and that you're using your position as owner to silence legitimate concerns about the facility's management." It was exactly the kind of narrative flip that Barbara excelled at, transforming herself from perpetrator to victim by omitting crucial details and reframing events to support her preferred story. She was betting that a television news report would force me to back down, rather than risk public scrutiny of Sunset Manor's operations. "Helen, I need you to prepare a complete file of Mrs. Walsh's residency record, payment history, and any documentation of complaints or concerns she raised about facility operations. Also get me copies of all the documentation related to her criminal charges. What are you planning to do?" "I'm going to make sure the reporter gets the complete story, not just Barbara's version of it." The Channel 7 news van arrived at Sunset Manor at 2 p.m., followed closely by my own car. I had spent the morning preparing for this confrontation, gathering documents and consulting with Robert about what I could and couldn't say publicly about ongoing criminal proceedings. I'd also called Detective Morrison to give her a heads up about the media attention. The reporter was a young woman named Jessica Torres who looked like she'd been covering local news for maybe 2 years. She was setting up her camera in the facility's lobby when I walked in, wearing my most professional suit and carrying a briefcase full of documentation that would either save Sunset Manor's reputation or destroy it completely. Barbara was already there, of course, dressed in a navy blue suit that made her look dignified and slightly fragile. She had positioned herself in one of the lobby's comfortable chairs with the facility's gardens visible through the windows behind her, creating a backdrop that suggested peaceful senior living rather than family warfare. "Mrs. Walsh," Jessica Torres began, her voice carrying the practiced empathy that television reporters used when interviewing sympathetic victims. "Can you tell us about your situation here at Sunset Manor?" Barbara's response was masterful in its manipulation of facts. She explained that she'd been a model resident for over 2 years, participating in community activities and maintaining her apartment impeccably. She described her shock at receiving a sudden eviction notice with no explanation beyond vague references to, quote, operational considerations. "I tried to ask questions about some concerning financial decisions I'd observed," Barbara said, her voice quavering slightly for effect. "But instead of addressing my concerns professionally, my daughter-in-law chose to abuse her power as the facility's owner to silence me." Jessica Torres turned to me. "Ms. Johnson, what's your response to Mrs. Walsh's allegations?" I had practiced this moment in my head dozens of times, but actually facing the camera while Barbara's lies hung in the air was more challenging than I'd anticipated. "Jessica, Mrs. Walsh is not being evicted. Her lease is being terminated at its natural expiration date according to the terms she agreed to when she moved in. The decision was made because her continued residency creates significant conflicts of interest for facility management." What kind of conflicts of interest? This was the crucial moment where I would either expose Barbara's lies or allow her narrative to stand unchallenged. "Mrs. Walsh is currently facing felony fraud charges for forging my signature and selling my house while I was unconscious during surgery. Having a resident under criminal investigation for defrauding the facility's owner creates obvious liability issues." Jessica Torres's eyes widened. Clearly, this wasn't the story Barbara had told her producers. "Mrs. Walsh, are you facing criminal charges?" Barbara's composed facade cracked slightly. "There's been a misunderstanding about some paperwork. My son asked me to handle some financial matters while Christine was recovering, and there's been a miscommunication about the extent of my authority." "Mrs. Walsh," I interjected quietly, opening my briefcase and removing a folder. "There was no miscommunication. Here are copies of the police report, the detective's findings, and the formal charges filed by the district attorney's office. You forged my signature and attempted to sell my house for $200,000 below market value to your friends." I handed copies of the documents to Jessica Torres, who scanned them quickly while Barbara sat frozen in her chair. The reporter's entire demeanor had shifted as she realized she'd been fed a false story designed to manipulate public sympathy. "Mrs. Walsh," Jessica said, her voice no longer carrying the sympathetic tone she'd used earlier, "these documents indicate that you're facing charges for forgery, fraud, and grand theft. Are you using this news interview to retaliate against the victim of your alleged crimes?" Barbara stood up abruptly, her carefully constructed persona dissolving into raw anger. "This is ridiculous. I'm a 68-year-old woman being persecuted by someone young enough to be my daughter. Christine has always resented me, and now she's using her money and influence to destroy my life." "Actually," I said, my voice still calm despite the adrenaline coursing through my system, "you tried to destroy my life by stealing my house. I'm simply ensuring that there are appropriate consequences for your actions." Jessica Torres turned back to her camera operator, clearly recognizing that the story had taken a dramatically different direction than expected. "Mrs. Walsh, given these allegations, do you think it's appropriate for you to continue living in a facility owned by someone you're accused of defrauding?" It was the question that cut to the heart of the matter, and Barbara had no good answer for it. She couldn't maintain her victim narrative while simultaneously defending her right to continue living in my property after allegedly stealing my home. "I have rights," Barbara said finally, but her voice lacked the conviction she'd displayed earlier. "You can't just throw elderly people out on the street because of family disagreements." "This isn't a family disagreement," I replied firmly. "This is a criminal matter being handled by law enforcement. Sunset Manor has an obligation to protect our other residents and staff from potential conflicts that could disrupt the community environment. After Jessica Torres finished her interviews and packed up her equipment, she approached me privately while Barbara retreated to her apartment. "Ms. Johnson, I have to say, this is very different from the story Mrs. Walsh's attorney described when they contacted our newsroom." "Barbara has an attorney?" Someone called claiming to represent her, saying this was a case of elder abuse and discrimination. But based on what I've seen today, it looks more like she's trying to use media pressure to avoid the consequences of criminal behavior. After the news crew left, I sat in my car in Sunset Manor's parking lot for several minutes, processing what had just happened. Barbara's attempt to use media attention to pressure me into backing down had not only failed, but had actually backfired spectacularly. By forcing me to present the complete factual record publicly, she had ensured that her criminal behavior was now documented not just in police reports, but in recorded interviews that could be used as evidence. More importantly, she had revealed the desperation behind her increasingly erratic attempts to avoid accountability. The confident, manipulative woman who had sold my house while I was unconscious was being replaced by someone making increasingly poor strategic decisions driven by panic rather than calculation. My phone rang as I was driving home. David's name appeared on the caller ID, and I answered with some trepidation, knowing he'd probably heard about the news interview from his mother. "Christine," his voice was strained but not angry, "Mom called me about the television crew. She's claiming you're trying to humiliate her publicly." "David, your mother contacted the media, not me. She gave an interview claiming I was abusing my position as Sunset Manor's owner to retaliate against her for raising legitimate concerns about facility operations. I simply corrected the record by explaining the real reason for her lease termination." There was a long pause before David responded. "What did you tell them?" "The truth. That she's facing criminal charges for forging my signature and selling our house, and that her continued residency at a facility I own creates obvious conflicts of interest." Another pause, longer this time. "Christine, I know what Mom did was wrong, but did you have to make it so public? Now it's going to be on the evening news." This was the conversation I'd been dreading, the moment when David would ask me to choose between justice and family peace. "David, your mother made it public when she called the television station. She was trying to pressure me into letting her stay at Sunset Manor by claiming I was discriminating against elderly residents. I had to defend myself and protect the facility. I understand that, but couldn't you have handled it more quietly? Found a way to let her save face? She sold our house while I was unconscious, David. She forged my signature and committed felony fraud. Why should she get to save face?" The silence stretched between us, filled with the weight of everything that had changed in our relationship over the past week. David was a good man who loved his family, but he was struggling to accept that his mother was capable of the crimes she'd committed. More than that, he was struggling to accept that his wife was strong enough to fight back rather than simply enduring the attack. "I'm not saying you're wrong," David said finally. "I'm just saying this is tearing our family apart." "Your mother tore our family apart when she decided to steal from me," I replied. "I'm just refusing to pretend it didn't happen." That evening, I watched Channel 7's 6 o'clock news broadcast from my living room, with David sitting tensely beside me on the couch. The story aired as the second segment, following a report about city budget negotiations. Jessica Torres's report was fair and factual, presenting both Barbara's initial claims and the documented evidence that contradicted them. The segment concluded with a brief interview with Robert Chen, who explained that lease non-renewals were standard business practices when conflicts of interest arose between residents and facility ownership. "Well," David said when the segment ended, "at least they presented both sides." I nodded, but my attention was already shifting to what would happen next. Barbara's public attempt to pressure me had failed, her legal position was weak, and her credibility was now damaged beyond repair. But wounded animals were often the most dangerous, and I had no illusions that this defeat would convince her to accept her situation gracefully. The next morning brought confirmation that Barbara was indeed escalating rather than retreating. Helen called me at 8 a.m. with news that would transform what had been a family conflict into something much larger and more dangerous. Christine, we received a formal complaint from the state licensing board this morning. Mrs. Walsh has filed allegations of financial mismanagement, discriminatory practices, and failure to provide adequate care to residents. I sat down heavily in my desk chair, feeling the familiar sensation of a crisis spinning beyond my control. What specific allegations? She's claiming that you've been using facility funds for personal expenses, that you're discriminating against residents who raise concerns about operations, and that several residents have complained about inadequate medical care but were ignored by management. Each allegation was carefully crafted to require extensive investigation and documentation to disprove. Even though they were false, responding to them would consume weeks of time and thousands of dollars in legal fees, while casting doubt on Sunset Manor's operations. Helen, I need you to prepare for a state inspection. Pull all our financial records, resident satisfaction surveys, medical care documentation, and staff certification records. Make sure everything is organized and readily available. How long do we have? Probably not long. State licensing boards tend to move quickly on complaints involving potential harm to residents. As I hung up the phone, I realized that Barbara had just escalated our conflict beyond the realm of family drama or even criminal justice. She was now threatening the business I'd built from nothing, the livelihoods of my employees, and the housing security of 60 innocent residents who had done nothing but have the misfortune of living in a facility owned by someone Barbara wanted to destroy. But in making this move, Barbara had also made a crucial strategic error. She had shifted from attacking me personally to attacking an institution with extensive documentation, regulatory oversight, and professional standards that could be independently verified. Instead of fighting on emotional terrain where her years of manipulation experience gave her advantages, she was now fighting on factual terrain, where my meticulous record-keeping and operational competence would tell the story. Barbara Walsh thought she was delivering a killing blow that would force me to surrender, rather than risk losing everything I'd built. What she didn't understand was that she had just chosen to fight me on the battlefield where I was strongest. The war was far from over, but the tide was about to turn in ways Barbara could never have anticipated. The state inspection arrived 3 weeks later, just as Barbara's 30-day notice was expiring. 2 investigators spent 4 days reviewing every aspect of Sunset Manor's operations, from financial records to resident care protocols. What they found was a facility that exceeded regulatory standards in every measurable category. Barbara's allegations crumbled under scrutiny. Financial records showed transparent accounting with clear separation between personal and business expenses. Resident satisfaction surveys ranked consistently in the top percentile statewide. Medical care documentation demonstrated attentive professional service that often went beyond minimum requirements. The investigators' final report didn't just dismiss Barbara's complaints. It commended Sunset Manor as a model facility. The licensing board sent a formal letter of recognition for operational excellence. Meanwhile, the criminal case proceeded swiftly. Faced with overwhelming evidence, Barbara accepted a plea agreement that included restitution, community service, and 2 years probation. The judge's comments during sentencing made clear his disgust with someone who would prey on a family member during medical crisis. David and I weathered the storm, our marriage emerging stronger after he witnessed his mother's true character. Barbara moved to a modest apartment across town, her reputation in ruins and her relationship with her son permanently damaged. 6 months later, I received an unexpected visitor at my office. Barbara stood in my doorway, looking older and defeated in a way that expensive clothes couldn't disguise. "I came to apologize," she said quietly. I studied her face, looking for signs of manipulation or calculation, but found only genuine remorse and exhaustion. "I convinced myself you didn't deserve David, that you were taking advantage of him somehow. I thought if I could create enough problems, he'd see through your act and end the marriage." Her voice cracked slightly. "I never imagined you actually owned the retirement home. I never bothered to learn who you really were or what you'd accomplished. I saw what I wanted to see. The admission hung between us like a bridge neither of us knew how to cross." "The house sale wasn't just about money," she continued. "I thought if you lost something important, you'd show your true colors, become vindictive or weak. Instead, you showed exactly who you are, someone strong enough to fight back when attacked. I remained silent, letting her finish. I lost my son because I couldn't accept that he'd found someone better than I thought he deserved. I lost my home because I underestimated someone I should have respected. I lost everything because I was too proud to admit I was wrong about you. Barbara straightened her shoulders with a dignity that reminded me briefly of the confident woman who had once commanded every room she entered. I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to know that I understand now. David married someone remarkable and I was too blind to see it. She turned to leave, then paused at the doorway. Take care of him, Christine. He deserves the happiness you've given him. After she left, I sat alone in my office, processing an apology I'd never expected to receive. Justice had been served through the courts. Consequences had been faced, and bridges had been burned. But hearing Barbara acknowledge the truth about what had really happened brought a sense of closure I hadn't realized I needed. That evening, I drove to Sunset Manor to check on the monthly residents' meeting. The dining room was full of familiar faces, people who had become extended family over the years I'd owned the facility. Mrs. Patterson waved me over to her table, where she was organizing a group trip to the botanical gardens. "Christine, dear," she said with a mischievous smile, "we've been thinking about getting a plaque for the dining room to commemorate the most exciting community meeting in Sunset Manor history." The table erupted in laughter. Even months later, the story of Barbara's public downfall remained a favorite topic of conversation among residents who had witnessed the confrontation. Looking around the room at these people who trusted me with their care, their security, and their community, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from building something that matters. Not just a profitable business, but a place where people could age with dignity and safety. Barbara had tried to destroy me because she couldn't accept that someone she'd underestimated had built a life worth protecting. In the end, her attack had only demonstrated the strength of what I'd created and the loyalty of the people who understood its value. Sometimes the best revenge isn't planning elaborate payback, but simply being so unshakably successful that your enemies destroy themselves trying to tear you down. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.